everybody, my name is Victoria, and today we are bringing you the most disappointing books that I read in the year of 2019. This year I read more books than I've ever read before, which also meant that I've probably read more books not to my taste than ever before, just because I was trying a lot of new things. I'm really happy that I tried a lot of new things. I wouldn't take it back for anything, because I feel like I became a much more well-versed reader in 2019. However, there are some books that I'm not likely to revisit. Now, not all of these books on this list were absolute dumpster fires. Some of them I actually did find some enjoyment. However, they may not have lived up to what I thought they were going to be. As always, take these videos for what they are, subjective opinions. You may love these books while I didn't enjoy these books as much. So, totally subjective, and I'm a little nervous making this video because I haven't actually made one of these before. Last year I didn't do a disappointing reads video, but here it is. Here are my most disappointing books of the year. So this year I made an attempt to read some thriller books, and I had not really gone into that genre very much, so I don't know if I'm a great judge of what a good thriller should be. However, I can tell you that I did not fully enjoy An Anonymous Girl by Greer Hendricks and Sarah Pekanen. This book was released early in the year, January 2019, I believe, maybe even a little bit before that. I actually have a whole book review on this book, so you can hear my more in-depth thoughts. I'll leave that in the description down below if you want to check it out. Basically, this book follows a young lady who is living alone. She has her own makeup business, and she kind of travels home to home and offers her makeup services. And she's looking for some extra cash, so she signs up for this study, and she volunteers herself to be a test subject and to just answer some questions about herself. This survey is run by this psychiatrist lady who is asking some very personal questions of her, and more kind of getting a little bit too close to her subject. And so that's sort of where we start our mystery thriller. I don't want to say anything more because in case you do want to read this book, you want to go into it pretty blindly so that you don't know too much about it up front. But this does revolve around a psychological study and a psychiatrist and her test subject. There are a lot of reasons this book didn't work for me, and you can see my book review if you want to find out more about that. But essentially, I think what it really boils down to with this one was that the main character was a little bit too smart. She came to conclusions very quickly that she didn't really have enough evidence to come to, in my opinion. Another thing that didn't really work for me in this book was the switching between the protagonist and the psychiatrist perspective. I actually felt like if we hadn't had the psychiatrist perspective, it would have been a little bit more of a scary, harrowing book, because I just felt like we knew too much about the villain. And I think the authors did this because they really wanted you to have a little bit of empathy for the villain. However, I just thought it would have been more effective if we didn't know every little inner working of the villain's mind. And if we just saw it from the protagonist's perspective, we would have been much more on the edge of our seat. I don't think this was a terrible thriller by any means. However, I wouldn't revisit it. I've heard amazing things about The Wife Between Us, which is their debut novel before this one, and so I still may pick it up. I've heard mixed things, but I still may try another one of their books. The next disappointing read that I would like to talk about is Black Leopard Red Wolf by Marlon James. This book is an African-inspired fantasy. However, it is definitely more literary fiction than I felt like it is fantasy. So that alone was a little bit deceiving the way it was marketed. This book wasn't marketed towards, I think, the right audiences. Now, I do really enjoy a good literary fiction. However, if I had known that, I think I might have been a little more prepared for what I received. So I just wish the marketing had been better for this one. That being said, I think I still wouldn't have liked it. This book follows our main protagonist, Tracker, and Tracker has an unusual, strong sense of smell, and he can literally track anyone, and he is often hired as sort of a mercenary to find people with bounties on their heads. And he is hired by some very mysterious, powerful people to find a child, a missing child. Along the way, he is joined by some other individuals who sort of form a team around him, and then they set off on this magical journey. This book was definitely unlike any book that I've read before, and not necessarily in a good way. A lot of things could have been better. The language in this book is really, I think, what stops you from enjoying it. The language and the writing style is very difficult to follow. It has very much of a stream of consciousness kind of writing style, which really is something that you have to get a feel for, and you also have to do it the right way as an author, and I just don't think it was done very well in this book. Upon learning more about this book, it was intentional on Marlon James's part. He did want you to feel like you weren't sure what was dream and what was reality, and that totally worked. I didn't know what was going on half the time, and so if you really wanted to confuse your reader, success. But I think the main thing that didn't work for me in this novel was the incredibly graphic scenes of violence and sexual violence, and just everything horrible that you could really ever think of happens in this book. There's bestiality in this novel as well. There's just horrific things. There's child dismemberment, horrible things. If I had known that, I wouldn't have picked this up. This is an author that I really don't know if I'm going to pick up anything else, because this book was just so off the wall and didn't work for me at all. So let me know down below if you're familiar with this author. Should I try anything else of his? Do you think you could change my mind, change my opinion? You definitely can't change my opinion about this book, but maybe about this author. I'm willing to maybe try something else by him. This next book that I'm going to be discussing needs a quick disclaimer. I didn't hate this book. It just didn't live up to my standards, and it was a little bit disappointing because I just expected this to be a 5-star book for me. It was about a 3-star book. Not a horrible book, but definitely not what I wanted out of it. And that was The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. The cover alone made me want to read this book. It was definitely a little bit of a cover buy. I'd never read anything by Samantha Shannon before, and so this was my first introduction to her. Not a bad author, not a bad book. However, I think I would have liked this to be a series. This was a standalone fantasy novel, and it was pretty info dumpy. We really could have benefited from a little bit more expansion of the world and to take a little bit more time with the world, which I just don't think you have the ability to do in a standalone. To me, it just suffered from being an 800-page book and dragging and being really hard to get into because you're just getting so much information at once. And I wouldn't have minded this being separated into 2 books, maybe 3 books. I think it would have been better. That being said, if this looks interesting to you, I definitely don't want to deter you from reading it, because I did have some fun times while reading it. You get a lot of build up in this book to the end, but then the ending is really wrapped up very quickly, which was also really frustrating to read. I still own a copy of this book, and I may even try to reread it someday and see if I still feel the same way. But for right now, this was definitely a book that left me feeling very middle of the road, and unfortunately was a little bit of a disappointment. The next book I'll be talking about is Descendant of the Crane by Joan He. This was a book that I got 50% of the way through and then DNF'd. I don't DNF books very easily, but I've found a lot of problems with the way this book was set up, and just felt like it was going nowhere. And if I'm halfway through a book and it's still going nowhere, I'm probably not going to continue. This book is a young adult Asian inspired fantasy, and the fantasy part is very much subtle. It's not a forefront of the story. This book actually turns into much more of a court drama, mystery, whodunit kind of story, which was just unexpected, and I didn't realize that's what I was getting myself into. Not a bad thing. However, it didn't build very well. The characters didn't feel very developed, and it also just felt like we got dropped into the world with very little explanation. I found myself confused a lot of the time of how things work, how the magic system works, who are these people who have magical powers. I think if I had maybe stuck with it a little longer, maybe I would have gotten some answers. But 50% of the way through, and I still didn't have the answers to any of those questions, it felt a little ridiculous to me and I gave up. And the last book that was a bit disappointing to me this year was a nonfiction book, which I picked up for Nonfiction November, and that was The Star-Spangled Banner by Mark Ferris. This was pitched as a book all about the Star-Spangled Banner and the history of the song and sort of its controversial background. Everything about this book sounded really interesting. However, the writing was really dry, and they assumed that you had a pretty solid background of American history and a lot of the details of American history. And for me, it's been a really long time since I've had an American history class. I need a little bit more help with the background and the different battles and important events. I just need a little bit of help. I'm not like a complete idiot when it comes to American history, but this book really assumes, I think, that you have a really solid knowledge, like historian's knowledge. And that was definitely not me. I found myself going through this book so slowly that it became frustrating because I always felt like I had to look up more information about whatever we were talking about at the time. And I wish the book had just kind of given me that information and given me a little bit of an overview before it talked about the specific details of the event. Does that make sense? I feel like I'm not making any sense while talking about this book, which is really indicative of my own experience trying to read this book. Those were all of the most disappointing reads of 2019. There were only really 5 of them, which I think is pretty good. Most of the books that I read this year I really enjoyed. If you would like to see my best books of 2019 video, I'll link that down below as well in case you're wanting to know what I actually did like. I hope you have a wonderful day and keep reading great books, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye-bye.